Good afternoon, everybody. Now, in any normal year, I'd ask anybody who saw us on the One show on the 6th of October to put your hands up. You still do that if you like, but nobody's going to see you. If you did see us, you'll have seen about 4.5 minutes of something that's a larger story, and I'm going to tell you about that today. The thing that I actually found most important on it was that we did a little bit of product placement, and we got the NAS mentioned 3 times on primetime television, and I kept sweeping my hair away from the NAS logo on my shirt. So it was a bit of fun that we were having with the BBC. Anyway, this man, who, if you note for later on, is photographed in front of Arishmel Gap in Dorset, is John Coward, and it's his fault that I'm here talking to you today. John's been diving around Dorset since Noah was sailing the Ark, and one day he was absolutely delighted because he found a twin-engined aeroplane underwater. He didn't know it was there, and when he tried to find some information about it, he couldn't find anybody else who knew it was there either. He'd looked in the diving books, shipwreck records, everywhere he could think of, and there was no reference. What he really wanted to find was reference to a British plane. In fact, he would have really liked it to have been a de Havilland Mosquito, but he did actually know that the chances of a balsa wood aeroplane surviving about 80 years underwater were somewhere between slim and none. But he'd found an aeroplane, a mystery, and an undocumented wreck. Meeting John on the coast one day, he asked us if we knew anything about the plane. Now, Martin, my other half, had a vague recollection of something in Dive Dorset. And when we looked, indeed, there is actually a reference to a 4-engined World War II bomber. So it could be that there are 2 planes in Warborough Bay, and that is possible. Or someone can't count engines, which is equally possible. However, Martin and I have a personal database of Dorset's underwater records, and it's from multiple sources, including Gordon Lepard, who I hope some of you remember him. He's a great guy. Gordon had listed reported aeroplane sinkings, and he'd put references into the sources of information. And to be honest, because our interests lie in ships, we'd not bothered with aeroplanes to this point. But the entries proved worth their while in this case, because there's 123 aeroplanes in the database. This guy's our godson, who was an NAS member and will be when I remember to renew his membership. It's Matthew Burley, and he's a 2nd generation aircraft engineer, and he's actually a self-confessed aircraft nerd. Matthew was on his way south one day and he invited himself for lunch. As he walked through the door, Martin asked him how many World War II twin V12 aircraft there were. Matthew started listing, and after about 15, Martin stopped him and showed him John's video. Being a much younger generation than us, Matthew took out his phone. Well, he would, wouldn't he? And he went to the right web starts for schematic drawings and started to make comparisons to the video. After about 1/4 of an hour, he pipes up, "It's not British." He says it's got the wrong kind of sump for a British plane. The Germans used the Daimler 600 series V12 engine, and that was inverted, so it had a flat sump. He said he was pretty sure that this was a Messerschmitt 110, but he wasn't sure which mark. Now, I'm no expert on World War II, but I do wonder whether a 1940s Messerschmitt is actually archaeology. I mean, you can go to the RAF Museum at Hendon and see a Messerschmitt 110G, and obviously there are photographs and schematic drawings on the internet. But 2 things we can learn from this wreck are, firstly, despite being underwater 80 years, it's still recognisable as an aeroplane. This suggests to us that the crew were actually in control until they landed the plane and jumped out, even in the water. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been looking like an aeroplane. It would just look like a debris field. The other thing we can learn is how it's deteriorated after 80 years underwater. But remember, this is still part of our heritage, and putting the story together adds to that heritage. Researching a story has been an interesting exercise in not only military, but social history. It's an example of how we can use available resources to put together a story. And given the anniversaries we commemorate on a regular basis, this is an argument as to why those resources should be available. At this point, I should point out the legal position. All military aircraft found underwater are automatically protected under the Protection Military Remains Act 1986. And given the amount of time we put into finding the history of this plane and the fact there could be live ammunition on it, nobody knows whether there is or not, it's fully understandable that this applies to all military aircraft. So, under the terms of the Act, the first thing we should do is report the finding to the RAF Air Historical Branch, which John duly did. Secondly, we can dive it, but we must not do anything which may disturb the site. Now, it doesn't seem that the Bream have told us this, because they've obviously been building their nests around it probably for the last 80 years. Now, this is, for those who are unaware, this is a bream nest. It's on a different side. In spring, they can make the landscape look like a lunar landscape. In fact, Ian Cundy was talking about them yesterday. You can find out more on, if you Google the Black Bream Project. And as a point of interest, a single male black bream in building one nest can move around 70 kilos of rocks, sediment, artifacts, ammunition. So keep your eyes out for those. Anyway, back to our story. If you look on here, you can clearly see that the sump plate's in place and it's flat. Because the engines were mounted on the plane with the pistons at the bottom, the Daimler used a separate tank to deliver oil to the engine, and the sump plate was flat. Whereas the British Merlin V12 engine used a more conventional configuration of pistons at the top and kept the conventional dome sump at the bottom. We went back to the database and searched for Messerschmitt, as Matthew suggested. Indeed, there is a mention of an ME 110 coming down between Arishmel Gap and Warborough Tout. Spot on. The reference DCC CD 1-3 was to a document in Dorset History Centre. Yes, sad that I am, I recognised where the reference came from. Now, we're all living through a global and national emergency, as my parents, probably your grandparents, were in 1940. The daily reports on the state of the COVID crisis from government show there's obviously been data gathered. It was no different during the war. Data was being fed to Westminster by the technology of the day. That would be post, telephone, telegram. And one of those sources of information was a daily report about downed aircraft, bombs, including unexploded bombs, and morale by the county chief constable. The reports supporting in Dorset are 3 folders of flimsy paper, about 4 inches deep, and totally fascinating reading. I wish that I had the time to digress and tell you about these documents alone. On the 7th of October, right at the tail end of the Battle of Britain, contained an entry. At Lulworth, between Arishmel Gap and Warborough Tout, machine ME 110 crashed at 16:30 hours into the sea. Occupants, 2, both prisoners, RAF notified. That is exactly where John had found the plane. We got a date for the wreck site. I should say here that 1,600 bombs were dropped on Sherborne, and that is in this sortie alone. 5 RAF planes crashed with 1 pilot killed and 3 hospitalised. 6 Luftwaffe aircraft didn't make it back to base. Of those, 5 people were killed, 4 injured, and to never heard of again, presumed somewhere mid-channel. 79 years on from that, our way forward, we felt, was to document this wreck and put it in the public record. By this time, we'd become a team. Matt Doggett, the underwater photographer, suggested that we could spend 2019 and early 2020 putting the story together for the 80th anniversary, and he would contact a TV company to broadcast it on the day. Despite COVID, we filmed in September and it was shown a day early, but experience has shown that's really good timing for the media. So our information, where'd that come from? We started with books. Now, much has been written about World War II, and much by people who were actually there, writing from memory, but not necessarily verifiable. We hope that they might point us towards the detail we needed. And the books were easily obtainable from the local library. We used the interlibrary loan scheme. Please think about using that, or we could end up losing it. They were excellent background reading and some interesting and amusing wartime stories. One, which I haven't verified, was about transporting the squadron mascot, a goat, to North Wales in an aircraft with no door. You can guess what the goat showered over Wales that night, but I digress. Lots of potential targets for an air raid over Dorset on that date. This map is by no means comprehensive, but it gives an idea of some of the places where the Luftwaffe could have been heading to. You might wonder why a delightful country town like Sherburn should receive 1,600 bombs. But if you note that it's only 6 miles from Yeovil, where Westland's factory making the Lysander aircraft was located, it makes much more sense. Despite what Hollywood tells us, precision bombing had not been invented. Anyway, I went through the online information of all the squadrons which existed in World War II and worked out which were fighter squadrons and which were bombers, and then where they were based in October 1940. Given that fuel was limited to about an hour, I'd already narrowed down airfields from where the defenders could have realistically launched from for a battle over Lyme Bay, the Purbeck coast, and Dorset to 4 airfields, possibly Saint-Ivel, 4 squadrons, Boscombe Down, 4 squadrons, Exeter, 3 squadrons, and the most likely, Warmwell, 3 squadrons. From there, I spent time in the home of the NAS members research group. See, I got the plug for them in as well. The National Archives, browsing through those 14 squadron reports of the date. The operation reports confirm 3 squadrons Warmwell, that's 609, 238 and 152 squadrons, which were operational on the right day in the right area. After a spell of poor flying weather, probably poor diving weather too, but you know, some things just don't change. It was a beautiful sunny day and it brought a raid of, depending on which account you read, 50 to 60 aircraft. There were Junkers bombers with Messerschmitt 109 and 110, and they were between Portland and the Westland Lysander factory. Both 238 and 609 squadron recorded shooting aircraft down for that sortie. But with so many planes in the air and no air traffic control, it was a very confused picture, and we needed to work out who shot what. There were also reports written by the pilots following each mission. This is where social history brings colour to the story. These guys were heroes. They were idolised by the general public. The general public felt that they were keeping them safe. They liked, you know, the local gentry invited them to the swanky parties, and they liked to drink or 3 in the local pub with the locals. Now, much of their time was spent hanging around, doing nothing, waiting for the weather to change and the enemy to attack. When that happened, from getting the call, it took 90, that's 90 seconds to get into their aircraft and go. Just think about that next time you sit on the taxiway waiting for a slot. They were in Spitfires. They were the greatest machine known at the time. Lewis Hamilton would have given his eye teeth to have been in a Spitfire in 1940. They were up for about an hour, or they ran out of fuel. They could black out because oxygen delivery systems were in their infancy. They were in a kill or be killed situation. So you can just imagine the amount of testosterone and adrenaline pumping around their bodies when they got back to base. And somebody at that point told them to sit down and write a report. I really wanted this guy to be our hero. He's Flight Lieutenant Frankie Howell, DFC, of course, who claimed 2 kills on the day, but his plane was shot down. But he did manage to land it in a field near Shaftesbury. Howell, true to form, was detained by the locals, obviously in the local pub, and he didn't get back to base until 4 a.m. And he was on the outside of several pints of the local beer. So we had a breakthrough. I managed to get an appointment to go to the RAF museum, that's the one at Hendon, and use their reading room. The guys there were really, really helpful. They found me a transcript of the diary that was written by the squadron during the Battle of Britain. So I managed to take some copies of that, which added more colour to the story. But they also found me this series of books. The author, that's Nigel Parker, has put a great deal of work into detail the Luftwaffe losses of World War II. And it was using the references from his book that found me 2 very important sources. First stop was the Imperial War Museum. They've got microfilm of the German records of the Luftwaffe losses of World War II. Now, you can't just turn up at the Imperial War Museum and use their reading room. You have to make an appointment. So I duly emailed the Imperial War Museum and asked for an appointment to come and look at them, as they instruct. They emailed back and asked what I wanted. I assumed that they wanted me to justify my place in the reading room, but no, it was to save me a trip by sending copies of the microfilm to me. Yes, it was that easy. The big problem is that they are in German, and my German is limited to zwei Bier bitte. Google Translate comes in very handy. Word might not be the exact translation, but you can get the gist of the document. Anyone who saw the One Show will know about our problem with translating jovial. If you didn't, if you buy Martin Einbier, he'll tell you the story. Nevertheless, this document gave us details of planes, pilots, woodfunkers. Isn't that an absolutely wonderful word? It actually means wireless operator. And of course, the other thing it gave us was the targets. So we had details of who claimed to have shot a plane down. We had details of where planes had been seen to land. We had details of which planes were missing from the Luftwaffe. It was a very confused story. And the other thing to do was to sit down with some clean sheets of paper, examine the source documentation and piece it together. February 2020 was the wettest on record. We spent it in the 20th century working out who shot what. Now, cutting a very long story short, we're close, but we're not 100% sure. 3 pilots shot at the plane, which is in Warburg Bay, but we can't say which plane, if any, administered the coup de grace. It's most likely this guy, Flying Officer John Dundas, DFC and bar, of course. Now, thanks to the 609 Squadron Association, who pointed me to the right website, I found out that he was the last remaining pre-war auxiliary pilot in the squadron, but he was only to live another 52 days. On the 28th of November 1940, with already having shot down a dozen Luftwaffe planes over the preceding months, Dundas shot down Flying Ace Helmut Vick, Now, he had the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and was credited with shooting down 56 RAF planes. That was quite an wingman shot him down, and Dundas crashed into the channel off the Isle of Wight. There is a memorial to him at Freshwater, unveiled in 2000. It was time to contact Air Historical Branch again. This time I rang them and explained that we had progressed further following the find. They requested that I confirm by email what we'd found out, but by now we'd covered all the avenues of investigation, and all that remained was for them to confirm that I had found which they did. They're looking forward to a copy of our report for their records. That's this winter's test. Second thing I learned from Nigel Parker's books is that the interrogation reports of Luftwaffe prisoners is in the National Archives, and it told me where to look. To be honest, I had spent hours looking up keywords in the Discovery catalogue, but I couldn't find anything. The prisoner of war records are not easy to find, perhaps because I'd been looking for prisoner of war rather than for interrogation reports, but who knows. There they were well hidden, but they were freely available. So February's NAS members research group meeting, the trip came and I was really excited. There they were, I found them. They were in English, but they gave a view of the pilots and the morale. One of them was very idealistic to the Nazi cause, but many were disillusioned and some really glad to be out of the war. I'm sorry to say this is where the trail of Flight Lieutenant Soma Bowden, who was the pilot, and Unter Officer Paul Prowler, who is the Boordfunker, ends. I'd done a lot of research trying to find out what happened to prisoners of war. It seems that in the early part of the war, many were shipped to Canada, but there's no record which supports that happened or did not happen to these two. Prisoner of war records are held by the Red Cross in Geneva, which you can access freely if you're a relative. So for me, that was a dead end. I contacted the German embassy to see if they could help. They felt there was little chance of finding the records in the German archives because German POW records are in Switzerland with the Red Cross. But they referred me to their archives and it's in German. I mean, who would have thought that? Anyway, we actually feel we've achieved the objective and can now document this wreck find with who the pilot was, that's Flight Lieutenant Soma Bowden, and the Boordfunker, Unter Officer Paul Prowler was, which plane it was, that is BF 110E1, that's serial number 3321, and who was most likely shot it down. That would be Flying Officer John Dundas, DFC and bar. Now our task is to put the information into public domain, which the One Show appearance was part of. The report will be on the internet once it's written, and we're planning to write some articles for magazines and journals. So that's the story of how we researched the Messerschmitt 110 for its 80th anniversary and how the NAS got another 4 minutes of fame. So all that remains now is for me to say thank you for listening and to say a big thank you to John Coward for letting me have his video and to Mark Doggett for letting me use his video and his 3Ds. And of course to Martin, who's used his prowess at putting a PowerPoint presentation together so that I can share it with you today.